Okay guys, so now it's time for social studies. So go ahead and get out your social studies book and your vocabulary notebook. Open up to page 264 in your social studies book and open up to a clean page in your vocabulary notebook, a clean page in the social studies section. So today we are doing chapter 8, lesson 3. So make sure you have that at the top of the clean page in your vocabulary notebook. And then as we read, we'll come across some words. And make sure you also have the date. So read along with me while I read out loud. We're on page 264. Transportation in the Midwest. The year is 1870. For hours, you watch workers load cargo onto the flatboats, large rafts made of boards tied together. So our first word is the word flatboats. And flatboats are large rafts made of boards tied together. So they're called flatboats because they are very flat. Imagine a raft, especially a raft like the one we read about when we read that story towards the beginning of the year that was called The Raft. It was a flatboat made by tying logs together. That is what a flatboat was. So back in the day, it was just a massive raft that may have filled up this whole room rather than just the small one that fit 2 people like in the story. These were massive, but they worked the same way as the raft in that story. They didn't have motors, they didn't have sails. It was just a flat boat made out of logs that were tied together. You can actually see one at the bottom of page 264, kind of right in the middle. You see the steamboats in the front and at the back, and then in the middle you see a flatboat. Kind of like what we think of as barges, except that barges have motors and engines and all that. But flatboats were just, they moved. We'll find out how they moved as we read. Then they lead your family's cows, pigs, dogs, and horses on board. Finally, you and the other passengers step aboard. It seems impossible that the flatboat can carry such a heavy load all the way down the Ohio River. You feel better knowing that thousands of other settlers have already made this trip. So back in these times, they didn't even have steamboats yet. Most of the time they traveled by flatboat. We're going to read about flatboats. They weren't the most ideal way of traveling because think about it. You'll find out why for sure. But think about being on a flatboat with no motors, no sails. It's way too big for you to steer it with a pole or to move it with a pole like in that story that we read because it's massive. It's like a size, not quite the size of a barge, but not much smaller. And at the bottom, you can kind of see a village around this time. You see the flatboats and maybe a couple steamboats going down the river. You see the port, and then you see the town up on top, above the river. Okay, let's move on to page 265. River highways. In the late 1700s, settlers began to use Midwest rivers for migration to the west. A migration is the movement of people from one place to the other. So our second word is the word migration, and it is the movement of people from one place to another. So this was a time of great migration. People had started along the East Coast, but it was getting too crowded. They were ready for some adventure. They were ready to explore. They were ready to have farms and things that they couldn't really do in the crowded cities of the East Coast. Moving west. Most pioneers traveled west by wagon. When they reached the Ohio River, many took flatboats. Each flatboat was about 40 feet long and could be used in shallow rivers. Flatboats had no power, so they only traveled downstream. At the end of a trip, flatboats were sold for their lumber. So that means each flatboat only made one trip. It started upstream, and then it followed the stream in the direction that the water was flowing. Because think about it, if you have no motor and you have no sail, your only option is to float in the same direction that the water is going. Well, once it got to the end of its journey, sometimes which was all the way in New Orleans, well, again, there was no motors, no steering, no sails, nothing. So they couldn't get that boat back up the river. They just sold it for scrap. So it wasn't too hard to get downriver, but imagine if you wanted to go upriver. If you were in Memphis and wanted to get to New Orleans, well, you could do that on a flatboat because the Mississippi River flows from north to south, which means you can get on that flatboat in Memphis, and the current will take it down to New Orleans. But then if you were in New Orleans and wanted to get back to Memphis by boat, you couldn't make that flatboat go against the current. So you just had to find another way back, which was not ideal. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, Robert Fulton and others developed the steamboat. A steamboat is a boat powered by a steam engine. So number 3 is the word steamboat, which is a boat powered by a steam engine. So let's talk about cause and effect here. Problem and solution. Well, the problem was that the flatboats could only go one way and you couldn't travel back up the river by boat. So the solution was that Robert Fulton and others that he worked with developed a steamboat which had an engine. An engine meant that it was able to travel in both directions. Let's keep reading. The engine turns the boat's large paddle wheel, causing the boat to move. Steamboats could travel upstream. They also traveled downstream much faster than flatboats. Trips that took weeks or months by flatboat took only days by steamboat. So, not only was a steamboat able to go in both directions, while a flatboat was only able to go downstream, steamboats were also much faster. Because think about it, if you're on a flatboat that only relies on the current, well, if it's not windy and that might take forever. But a steamboat, has an engine, so you could put more coal in there to make it go a little faster. The cost of shipping goods dropped and travel increased. The cost of shipping goods went down because it wasn't as hard to make that journey. Once it's easier to make the journey or to make something, the prices go down because they can do it more often. So it's not as hard to get these products to people, so they don't have to charge as much. Well, let's do the reading check. Remember, this is like the skills, these are like all these other problems where I'm going to ask the question, you're going to pause the video, answer it underneath your vocabulary, and then play the video to check if you're correct. So the question is, how did steamboats change river travel? Well, steamboats changed river travel because, first of all, they could go both directions, up and downstream. And they also made things faster, which made the cost of shipping things cheaper. So, there was a lot of good things about steamboats. Okay, it also, never mind, I'm sorry. Okay, so now we're going to pause on reading and we're going to look at this map on the top of page 265. Okay, so we're looking at the map on the top of page 265, and we see that it is titled Settlers Move West, 1790 to 1890. So this is an example of a historical map, which we talked about in the last lesson. And it shows the United States as it was settled. So this key tells us when it was settled. This red color which we see all along the East Coast, was all settled before 1790. So everybody that lived in these red areas had moved here before 1790. Then, between 1790 and 1820, the darker orange was then settled. So all of this darker orange became settled between 1790 and 1820. When it says settled by 1820, that means the orange, the borders of the orange, was not settled yet in the year 1820, but everything that is orange, was. Then we have yellow, which was settled between 1820 and 1850. So after the orange, then we start to see this yellow. And then we go further, and then this tan color was settled between 1850 and 1860, and it moves a little further. We can see that there wasn't as much new settlement between 1850 and 1860 than there was between the other ranges. However, from 1790 to 1820 is 30 years. From 1820 to 1850 is 30 years. So of course there was going to be a lot of settlement then. But from 1850 to 1860 was only 10 years. So that's probably why there was a little less settlement that happened between 1850 and 1860. And then the green is what was settled. So this green along the edge is what was settled in the 30 years between 1860 and 1890. And then all the parts that are this lighter tan cream color were places that are current day United States but were not settled yet. So all this area around the green was not settled yet. So we can see as time moved on over the 1800s, the United States got more and more settled. These settlements moved further and further west, which is what we talked about in Friday's lesson, Early History of the Midwest. Okay, if you want to study that map a little longer, go right ahead, and then continue the video and turn the page. Okay, so now you should be on page 266, and read along with me. Railroads. Beginning in the mid-1800s, railroad companies built miles of train tracks across the Midwest. The new railroads helped the region grow even more. Railroad towns. Railroads provided an easier way for settlers to reach the Midwest. Remember, up until this point, they relied on wagons and then either flatboats or steamboats. But still, a wagon, even though the steamboats were faster than the flatboats, the wagons were not very fast at all. They were very slow. And up until now, there wasn't another option other than going on foot. Well, obviously, a wagon, you need to carry all of your belongings because people were moving their whole lives. So now we come across another problem. Wagons are too slow. So let's see what solution they came up with. As more people arrived, new towns grew up along the tracks. Also, older towns grew larger. These included Topeka in Kansas, Kansas City in Missouri, and Omaha in Nebraska. So, as these railroads came to town, well, that meant more people were able to live along the line. Because think of it, if you're way back then, you want to live closest to the easiest and quickest form of transportation. And with these railroads, you want to live near the railroad tracks. So that means brand new towns started popping up along these railroad tracks, and then cities that were already there grew larger because people got out in these cities and decided to live there more often than people left them because they weren't quite crowded yet. By 1856, Chicago, Illinois had become one of the world's busiest railroad centers. The city connected 10 major railroad lines and about 3,000 miles of track. Every day, nearly 100 trains arrived to or left from the city. So Chicago is one of those towns that grew up along a railroad track and because of a railroad. So that was the solution. The problem was wagons were too slow, so then they created these railroads to make it even faster. New businesses. The railroad towns attracted many entrepreneurs, or people who start new businesses. So So think about it. You've got these brand new towns. Well, you need businesses in them in order for them to grow. You need things like grocery stores and clothing stores and hardware stores and doctor's offices and all those kind of things. So these entrepreneurs this is a French word. These entrepreneurs, or people who start new businesses, came to town. Entrepreneurs open businesses to serve the region's growing population. So they open businesses like what we've already mentioned. Grocery stores, which are not the same as what, none of these were the same as what we think of today, but places that sold groceries, places that sold fabric for clothing, places that where you could buy and sell stock, like livestock, places where you could buy and sell farming equipment and seeds and things you needed for farming. Schools were another thing that were added. All of these cities needed these new things. Hospitals or doctors' offices came to town. So all of these new businesses were being brought to these growing towns by these entrepreneurs. Some cattle traders opened stockyards in the town. A stockyard is a place where livestock is bought, sold, and held before shipment. So our next word is the word, not livestock, stockyards. Which is where livestock, so places where livestock is bought, so you could go there to buy some cows for your farm or some pigs for your farm. Sold, so if you had too many cows, you couldn't feed them all, or you just didn't need that many, you could go and sell them for money. Or held before shipment. And what that means is, well, people in the East Coast and people in the more rural areas in the Midwest still needed livestock for meat and things like that. So you would bring, if you were selling a cow, you would bring it to the stockyard. You may sell it to another farmer or rancher, or you may sell it to somebody who's going to ship it to the East Coast in order for people there to have meat and the things that the livestock provides. In Abilene, Kansas, Joseph McCoy opened one of the largest stockyards in the region. Texas and Oklahoma ranchers drove their herds in cattle drives to McCoy's and other stockyards. So did ranchers in the Midwest. So what that means is that ranchers, which are people who raise livestock, remember farmers are people who grow crops, ranchers are people who raise livestock, they would do these things called cattle drives, which is where people, what we come to think of as cowboys, would actually lead they would kind of lead the livestock to these stockyards, because back then they didn't have semi-trucks to ship, the railroads didn't go everywhere, and wagons were too small to hold a whole herd of cattle that you were trying to sell. So you actually had to lead them on foot to the stockyard. And that's where we get that's where cowboys come in, because cowboys were the people who actually led the herd of cows to the stockyard. So cowboys, because they led the cows. There's a lot more that goes into it than that, but that's just a basic idea of where we get the idea of cowboys. From the stockyards, railroad cars took the cattle to cities to be prepared for markets in the east. So those stockyards then loaded, once they got to the stockyards, the stockyards had to be near railroads, because then that livestock would be loaded onto train cars to be brought to the East Coast in order to be prepared to be sold, usually as meat. Okay, so now let's look at the picture at the top. we see where it says railroads attracted new people and businesses to towns along the train routes in the Midwest. Now schools were considered a new business, doctor's offices. Again, general stores where they sold things like butter and seeds and all that kind of thing. Stockyards. These are all examples of new businesses that started showing up along these railroads. And you can see a picture up here. You can see the Native Americans. You can see the small little town that's along a railroad car. I mean, that's how close they were. And they didn't really have train stations back then. What it was the train would just pull up, people would unload the stuff, and then they'd get back on and keep going. You didn't even have to go to a railway station. Your house was like right there. Or usually the businesses were the closest, and then you would go there to get your stuff. So what I want you to do now is we're going to do the reading check. I'll read the question, you pause the video, answer it in your notebook, and then play the video to check your answer. So it says, how did railroads change the Midwest? Okay, well, they helped the Midwest grow by providing an easier way for settlers, so not only settlers and people to reach the region, but also goods to reach the region. So it was faster, it was easier than ever before, because before, first, they had wagons and flatboats, which was really difficult. Then they had wagons and steamboats. Well, now they had railroads, and railroads would be on bridges across water, so they didn't even have to worry about they didn't even have to really worry about water travel anymore. Okay, so now you should be reading with me on page 267. Industries grow. Better transportation helped cities and industries in the Midwest grow. Boats and trains brought raw materials to these cities. They also carried finished products to buyers. So now we're moving on from these little railroad towns, and now because of railroads and steamboats and all the transportation up to now, even these little railroad towns like Chicago, Illinois, are starting to be built up into these big major cities. Remember, cities are where the industries and the factories are. So as these cities got bigger and bigger and bigger, well then they started doing a lot more manufacturing. And that's what we're going to read about next. Port cities. The region's largest cities grew near ports. River ports included St. Louis, Missouri, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Port cities that grew along the Great Lakes included Chicago, Illinois, Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan. So again, they're still, just like all those cities we talked about in the southeast and the northeast, the cities are still growing the biggest along ports where it's easy to get to them by water. Because even then, with the trains couldn't hold as much as these really, really big steamboats. So a lot of the major shipping was actually still done by steamboats. And you can see, let's see, the river ports, well, St. Louis, Missouri, and Minneapolis, Minnesota are along the Mississippi River, and then Cincinnati, Ohio is along the Ohio River. These are major rivers. And then we've got the port cities along the Great Lakes. Remember, those are those 5 huge lakes up that form part of the northern border of the Midwest. And those were Chicago, Illinois, which is on Lake Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, which I think is on, not Lake Erie, maybe Lake Erie? Yes, Lake Erie. Cleveland, Ohio is along Lake Erie. And then Detroit, Michigan, which is also, it's along Lake Ontario. You'll have to check me. I might not be right about Lake Ontario. But they're all along one of the Great Lakes. The automobile industry. In the early 1900s, Detroit became the center of the nation's automobile industry. One reason for this was the city's location on the Great Lakes. So remember, the Great Lakes they were able to ship things easily across the Great Lakes on these big steamboats. The region's steel industry was another reason. So in order to make automobiles or cars, you need steel. So Detroit became a major, major producer of automobiles because it was along the Great Lakes, which made it easier to ship these cars once they were finished, but also because of how close it was to steel mills. Mills in Gary, Indiana, and other nearby cities provided the steel needed to make automobiles. So it was very easy. These steel mills were nearby, so they did not even have to wait for the steel to cross rivers. They could put the steel on trains, take the train up to Detroit, which was a much quicker than going across the lakes or by using wagons. And then once it got to Detroit, well, then the automobile factories could make the cars and then ship them very easily over the Great Lakes, which connected to many large rivers. Henry Ford and others helped the automobile industry grow. In 1913, Ford set up an assembly line in his Detroit factory. And you may think that the name Ford sounds familiar, and you may think it's because of Ford cars. Well, Henry Ford was the one who first started the Ford Car Company. So we still have Fords today. That company was originally started by Henry Ford. An assembly line is a line of workers along which a product moves as it is put together one step at a time. So, number 6 is the word assembly line, or the phrase, really, term, I guess we could call it. And an assembly line is a line of workers along which a product is moved as it is put together one piece at a time. So Henry Ford is really known for this assembly line concept. He was one of the first to use this, if not the first, I have to look it up to be sure, to use this idea, which is where it was much quicker to move the car along an assembly line where one worker would do one thing as they went down instead of one person building one car at a time. They were able to go much faster. So one person's job was to put together the steel pieces to make the hood. And then the next person's job was to install the headlights, and so on and so on. They put together one piece at a time. Imagine if you had to make 20 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. You could make all 20 by yourself, but that would take all morning. What would be quicker is if you got your friends and family together, and you were in charge of getting the bread out of the bag, and then you sent it along to the next person. The next person put the peanut butter on, and then they pushed it down, and the next person put the jelly on, and meanwhile, you're still putting bread. You're still grabbing bread while everybody else is moving it. So you're taking the bread out, passing it to the next person. They're putting the peanut butter on. While they're putting the peanut butter on, you're getting more bread. Then they pass the peanut butter bread to the next person who puts the jelly on, while you are getting out more bread, and so on until you've got 20 sandwiches made in like 15 minutes instead of 3 hours. Now, it may not take that long, but imagine if it was a car. Assembly lines made things much quicker, which again, the quicker they were able to make things, the more they could make, so the cheaper they would be. It is so assembly lines are a form of mass production in which a product is made more quickly and cheaply by using machines. So, number 7, let's see. Okay, if you are not caught up with vocabulary, go ahead and pause right now and do it, because I just don't have enough space to write it where it's easily readable. So I'm going to go ahead and erase. And we'll start with number 7 at the top. If I went too fast and you were still writing, well, obviously you can just rewind the video a little bit and pause it. Okay, so number 7 is mass production, which means that a product is made more quickly and cheaply by using machines. industries are made and manufacturers come about because they are able to make more goods more quickly and more cheaply, so then more people are able to buy them. The prices of the products go down the more they have. Remember, it's that supply and demand thing. So if the supply is huge, then the price goes down because more people want it and they're trying to compete with others. So at the bottom of this page, of page 267, we can actually see one of Henry Ford's factories. And we see this assembly line. So we see each of these men that we see have a job. They put one piece on, or they attach one piece, or they have one job. And so as they go, the cars are on this little conveyor belt, and they just move. And as they go, the cars don't stop moving. The cars just keep moving, so these men have to get, or women after a while, have to get really good at doing their job well, but quickly. Otherwise, the car would keep going without the job being done, which would of course lead to safety issues and all kinds of other problems. So these conveyor belts wouldn't stop unless there was a big emergency of some sort. And so these men and later women would just do their job and it would keep going, and then the next car would come and they'd do it there, and then the next car, and so on until the end of the day. Okay, now we're going to look at the table on page 267. Okay, so this table on page 267 shows that mass production allowed automobiles to be made more cheaply. In turn, more people could afford to buy them. So, the title of this table is Automobiles in the United States, 1900 to 2004. So on the left we have the year, and then on the right we have the number of automobiles. So this is not the number of automobiles that exist, but the number of automobiles that people own. So in the year 1900, 8,000 people owned automobiles, or people owned 8,000 automobiles, not 8,000 people. 8,000 automobiles were owned. Then in 1925, we see that 17,481,001 automobiles were owned by people. And then by 1950, 40,339,077 automobiles were out there being owned. And then in 1975, 106,705,934 automobiles were owned. And then in 2004, which is when this book was published, 136,430,651 automobiles are owned. So you can see that back in 1800, there weren't that many automobiles compared to how many there are today. But just like what we learned, mass production allowed more automobiles to be made more cheaply so more people could afford to buy them. So as time went on, more people could afford to buy cars, and cars became more and more necessary, so they did. If we look at this map, we see that this table, we see that between 1950 and 1970 is when automobile ownership increased the most. It went from around 40 million to around almost 107 million. That is a massive amount of growth. I think like 67 million new cars went on the road between those years. So we can see this table just shows that over time, automobile manufacturing got easier and cheaper, so more and more people were able to afford automobiles, and we also know they became more and more necessary. Okay, so you should be on page 268, and we're going to go ahead and read the last page of the lesson. Mass production grows. Other industries in Midwest cities also started using mass production. Factories made furniture, food products, steel products, and more. By the mid-1900s, an industrial economy had developed in parts of the Midwest, especially along the Great Lakes. Remember, they developed along the Great Lakes because of how close they were to the Great Lakes, so they could ship easily across it, and then down rivers that the source is the Great Lakes, or the mouth is the Great Lakes. And then also because there was a lot of steel production going on along the Great Lakes. So that way these factories were able to get the steel they needed to make their products. In an industrial economy, most goods are made by machines and in factories. So number 8 is the term industrial economy, which is an economy in which most goods are made in factories by machines. So before this, we had more of an agricultural economy where most goods were made by hand, and you get the materials to make these things on your own from like farms and stuff like that. But then we moved, because of all this new transportation, the steamboats and the trains, we moved into an industrial economy because more towns were popping up, more people were moving into these towns. It was easier to transport goods, and so they were able to start these factories and easily ship things from one place to another. Of course, not as easily as we can now, but easier than they ever had before. So now what we're going to do, let's look at the picture on page 268. This is Madam C.J. Walker, who started a manufacturing company in Illinois, Indiana that made beauty products for women across the nation. There's actually a movie about her on Netflix. I'm not sure what it's rated though, so you may not be able to watch it. But I do know I saw that there was a movie on Netflix about her that I have been wanting to watch. She was a woman from this time period, late 1800s, early 1900s, who started her own business. And this, first of all, it was not common for women to start a business, especially a manufacturing business, and it was even less common for women of color, like Madam C.J. Walker, to start a business. So she was a major pioneer of industry back in her day. Okay, so let's do the reading check question now. I'll ask the question, you pause the video, answer it underneath your vocabulary, and then play the video to check. So what is mass production? Okay, well, if you said mass production is a form of production in which a product is made more quickly and cheaply by using machines, then you are correct. We actually still have the vocabulary, the definition right here. So now let's read the summary, and then we'll talk about the homework. In the 1800s, steamboats and railroads added to the growth of cities and industries in the Midwest. The region's largest cities developed around ports. During the 1900s, the automobile industry and other manufacturing industries grew in many of these cities. Okay, so for the social studies homework, go ahead and open up the Wednesday, May 6th packet. Of course, this is the only thing in your packet. And you have your transportation in the Midwest homework. The directions for the first part are, say, match each city's description with the letter of the correct city. So, where was a Mississippi River point? You're going to choose which of these cities. All of these cities, the answer is in your textbook. You just have to look for that city name. Some you may be able to use the process of elimination if you're not so sure. The next part says match each term with the correct definition. So you have some vocabulary words, and then you're going to match them with the correct definition. You can use your vocabulary notebook for that. Then on the back, you have a few short answer questions. Make sure that you put some thought into it. Don't just quickly put an answer down. Make sure you check it. Make sure that the answer actually answers the question being asked. Some of you have been turning things in with an answer down that doesn't answer the question. It doesn't make any sense at all. So make sure that you're checking. I know this is getting tough. It's getting towards the end of the year, but you're still being graded. So you need to make sure that you are doing your best work. So you have some short answer questions. You'll be able to find the answers in your textbook. Make sure you write in complete sentences. You have plenty of room. The answers are in your textbook or in this video that we talked about today. Okay, so that's it. You can go ahead and do that homework right now, or you can wait until later today. If you have any questions about today's lesson, then go ahead and reach out to me between 1 and 5 this afternoon.